Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to another exciting edition of Fighting Game Thursday. Recently on this channel we have been looking back at some of the most heavily requested topics that I have ever received on here, such as Soul Calibur and Bloody Raw. This episode is going to be no different, as I shall be covering yet another in-demand fighting game favourite, a title from literally one of the hottest franchises ever created. That's right, as the thumbnail suggests, we are going to be taking a trip back through time to analyse the history of the maiden entry from the Dead or Alive series. A particularly sexy maiden entry that would innovate in the world of fighters by introducing technically impressive jiggle physics. This mechanic would give the gaming public two very good reasons as to why they would never forget this game, making it of the utmost importance to revisit today. So without further ado, get your box of tissues ready, as this, ladies and gentlemen, is the tantalising tale of Dead or Alive. The fighting game built around violence and sexuality with graphics that seem to offend game journalists everywhere. Yeah! As covered on this channel in plenty of other videos, the mid-90s was not just a pivotal time for fighting games, but video games overall, with more and more development houses and publishers moving their focus from 2D sprite-based gaming to video games featuring 3D polygonal models. The first fighting game to use realistic 3D character models, or any video game at all to be fair, was Sega's Virtua Fighter, the pioneering 1993 title that would help revolutionise gaming. The game would end up being a huge commercial success, particularly in Japan, with Virtua Fighter becoming the country's highest grossing arcade title of 1994. Others in the arcade industry would look on enviously at Sega's success with Virtua Fighter, including the likes of Tecmo, a Japanese company who were finding themselves in financial trouble at the time. The publisher and developer, who were behind the likes of Ninja Gaiden, were struggling to develop and publish hit titles of their own, and like many entities within the arcade industry, would begin to look at Virtua Fighter as a source for inspiration. This would lead to higher-ups in the coin-op division of the company to order their employees to create a game that looks and plays similarly to Virtua Fighter. The man who was tasked with leading this mission was Tomonobu Itagaki, a gentleman who had joined the company back in 1992 as a graphics programmer. Itagaki would initially work on Super Tecmo Bowl for the Super Nintendo, and would quickly learn a lot working for Tecmo under the mentorship of Akihiko Shimoji, creator of Tecmo Bowl, and Yoshiaki Inoue, the brain behind Solomon's Key, Bomb Jack, Ryga, and even the classic original Ninja Gaiden game. As their student, he was impressed with their ability to include fun as a necessary component amongst all of their projects. As the lead in charge of Tecmo's Virtua Fighter-like game though, Itagaki automatically noted a flaw with creating a Virtua Fighter-like game, and that was that every greedy arcade publisher under the sun was also going to order their employees to copy Virtua Fighter, so knew that in order to stand any chance whatsoever of his game being a success, he would need to think up selling points that would allow his franchise to stand out from the pack, especially bearing in mind that the likes of Virtua Fighter 2 had even hit the market. More interestingly, the Tecmo game, like Virtua Fighter 2, would run on the same Sega Model 2 arcade board, as Sega had begun licensing their hardware to third-party companies. So Itagaki needed a game capable of utilising the technology that stood out from Virtua Fighter 2, that could somehow carve out a market segment for itself. The concept to achieve this ended up being quite simple: create a polygonal fighting game that placed a much heavier emphasis around the provocation of the player than any of the competing games. Believing that in order to stand the best chance for success, his game needed to deliver a slice of entertainment built around both sexuality and violence. So before we move on any further, let's talk about the part everyone probably wants to hear about. The part of the plan involving sexuality. Ooh. Dead or Alive would be a video game that utilised motion capture technology, allowing for fighting in the game to look as realistic as possible. But the game would also include a mechanic that Itagaki would later christen as breast physics, You see, breast physics amongst the fighting game medium was not something that was completely new, as such a concept had been played with in the genre as early as 1992. That year would see SNK introduce the character Mai into Fatal Fury 2, with her character sprite in combat having noticeably jiggly breasts. Being a man of culture, Itagaki would notice this game design choice, and wanted to create a fighting game which innovated on this feature more than any game previously. Bring jiggle physics into the third dimension of video gaming. To put it simply, Itagaki was a modern day hero, and became responsible for a fighting game series that became just as identifiable for its depiction of breasts as it did its fighting. So how exactly did Dead or Alive's pioneering graphical design work? Well, to put it as simply as possible, breast physics is an application of soft body dynamics, the field of computer graphics that focuses on physical simulations of the motion and properties of deformable objects. In a game with 3D graphics, character models are composed of a skeleton of bones, connected with joints and covered by a skin of textured polygons. These virtual bones do not necessarily correspond to the bones in real humans, but are required to make anything move. In Dead or Alive, to make breasts or other body parts move, the game's animators make the bone joints move according to the physical rules of the game's engine. To effect, the breasts are connected to breastbones which are equipped with springs that make the breasts bounce when the rest of the skeleton moves. The setup and strength of these springs determines the strength of the breast bounce. Yeah, science, bitch. The Sega Model 2 game would be unveiled alongside Jaleco's Super GT 24H at the February AOU show as part of Sega's announcement that they would be licensing the Model 2 hardware to third parties going forward. This was an era whereby the market for polygonal fighting games was becoming more crowded by the second, with the likes of a Tekken series emerging as the most dominant force. DOA would add more to the genre though than just attractive eye candy, which would give the franchise a further leg up in such a competitive environment. The game would include further gimmicks and features that would prove interesting to fans, all of which we shall soon get to discussing. The game's arcade attract sequence, and I use the term attract very literally, shows off this impressive game in action. UK video game magazine Maximum would manage to visit Tecmo overseas while the game was still in development, with the publication reporting that the game looks as good as it does due to the motion capture for the game being done at one of Japan's largest motion capture labs, resulting in a game featuring real professional martial artists and at least one famous Japanese actor to capture realism in the character's movements. They would report it has helped lead to a game that includes luxuriously smooth animation and fluid execution of attacks, with the game looking even smoother than Virtua Fighter 2. Dead or Alive's provocative presentation would certainly allow the game to garner a lot of mainstream attention, but away from the advanced graphics and jiggle physics, the fighting system was equally as impressive. Basically, while the majority of fighting games from the period relied on a guard button in order to allow players to block oncoming attacks, instead Dead or Alive innovatively included a hold button. This essentially means that fighters can grab at their opponent's limbs while they are being attacked. This intuitive countering system was the first in the fighting game genre to utilise different commands that correspond to each type of attack. In combat, there are two different types of holds that can be implemented: offensive holds and defensive ones. Defensive holds can force away or counter damage an opposing fighter. Earlier in the video, I noted that Itagaki built Dead or Alive around sexuality and violence. In terms of upping the violence in this game, when placed alongside its many polygonal contemporaries, the decision was made to place what are known as danger zones around the outer edge of the arena. What this means is that these areas are set with explosive devices that can deal high amounts of damage to fighters who have the misfortune of coming into contact with them. Additionally, they can explode characters up into the air, allowing their opponents to execute juggling air combos, bringing a further practical use to all of this lunacy. All in all, the game differentiated itself from other 3D fighters such as the Tekken games with its features beyond just jiggly boobs, including these crazy explosives, and the game's unique countering system that places a heavy emphasis on speedy combat. Like most fighting games, the gameplay is laced together with a plot, one of which isn't much different from other fighters. Basically, we have a recurring trope of an evil corporation behind a fighting game tournament. In the case of this game, DOTEC, standing for Dead or Alive Tournament Executive Committee. Their tournaments are regularly occurring and invite fighters from all over the world to become world champion and win vast amounts of money. A runaway named Kasumi enters the Dead or Alive tournament to seek revenge against her uncle, RyoGamestation, who was responsible for crippling her brother. The original arcade version of the game featured a selectable, colourful lineup of characters, including Bayman, a Russian mercenary hired to kill the tournament host, Jianfu, an old Chinese martial artist who wants to win the prize money to provide funds for his sick granddaughter, Janli, a Jeet Kune Do martial artist who, like many other fighting game characters, is modelled after Bruce Lee, Kasumi, who we mentioned earlier, who comes from the ninja clan and wants revenge for her crippled brother, Fang, the rival of Janli, Tina Armstrong, a flamboyant American pro wrestler, Zack, an American DJ and kickboxer, and Ryu Hayabusa, a crossover character from the Ninja Gaiden series. The last boss, and also an unlockable in the game, is of course RyoGamestation, who we mentioned when summarising the game's story. He is an evil ninja who has been exiled from his own clan. After the game's initial arcade release on November 26, 1996, by January 1st, 1997, publication Game Machine would list the game as Japan's most successful arcade title of the month. While the cabinets were not widely distributed outside of Japan, this did not stop Dead or Alive becoming a commercial success, earning Tecmo profits of $9.2 million, essentially saving Tecmo from the threat of bankruptcy and giving them buoyancy in the arcade market once more. Being a game that was developed to run on the Sega System 2 arcade board would mean that converting the game to run on the Sega Saturn was the logical and practical thing to do. The only issue was that by the time the game was ready for the Saturn launch in October of 1997, was that the hardware had practically fizzled out away from Japan. Therefore, the Sega Saturn version of the game would see release as a Japan exclusive. The Saturn version looked very good and would include an all-new pre-rendered cinematic introductory sequence. Next Generation magazine would cover the release of the game for the hardware, with them noting that the fighting game mimics Virtua Fighter 2 in its looks and feel to a frightening degree. Dead or Alive boasts smooth control, crisp polygonal graphics, and an attitude that may enable this game to stand on its own despite its familiar origins. They identify the variety of characters and the danger zones as the game's standout features, and so the tough AI forces players to learn more complex moves and strategies. Sega Saturn magazine described Dead or Alive as an incredible fighter, both technically and visually, even getting close to beating Sega's own brand Virtua Fighter games. Computer and Video Games called it an essential buy for import Saturn gamers, while Next Generation commented, Dead or Alive is such a polished game that it's surprising to realise this is Tecmo's first 3D fighter. The main feature that journalists tended to laud was the game's hold mechanic, praising it for adding a unique tone to the title and blurring the lines between offensive and defensive manoeuvres. GameSpot noted that using holds you can counter holds and attacks and then reverse counters on top of that. So you sometimes can get an awesome Jackie Chan style grappling match that goes back and forth 3 or 4 times till someone messes up and pays the consequences. Hilariously, while being perhaps the main feature as to why most people remember Dead or Alive today, most game journalists hated the jiggle physics and would widely ridicule them, showing that perhaps a lot of opinions game journalists have are not simply down to modern sensitivities. The exaggerated and prolonged bouncy animations would be referred to from comical to downright grotesque. Sega Saturn magazine, for example, would hilariously note that the breasts wobble up and down like jellies and seem to operate totally independently to the rest of the girl's body. Jeff Gerstmann from GameSpot was equally unimpressed by the boobs, writing, "They bounce around like gelatine for no apparent reason." He considered it a relief that the feature can be turned off, describing it as stupid and the very definition of overkill. IGN was not annoyed but pointed out that the bouncing breasts don't actually contribute to the gameplay, except to add temporary novelty and libido frustration to the typical gamer. So they basically inferred that none of us can get laid. But this is a 90s review we are talking about, and I have since noticed that they have chose to revise their review completely in 2012, so that they could refer to the game as gratuitously sexist. The game would go on to shift 161,000 units, but if Tecmo planned to reach the true global gaming market, a Sony PlayStation conversion of the game would be needed. A Sony PlayStation version of the game would finally be ready for March of 1998, and over a course of a few months was eventually released across all major regions. Dead or Alive for the Sony PlayStation was a history-defining game, not just for its jiggle physics and other unique mechanics, but also because it was the first ever game that had been developed on Sega arcade hardware that was being converted to run on the Sony PlayStation. The port really was a physical manifestation of how bad things were beginning to go for Sega. To further increase the game's chances of selling against the likes of the uber impressive Tekken 3, the game would need to be completely revamped with different graphics, a new fighting game engine, but also a ton of new content including background music and alternative costumes. In fact, Tecmo would even go as far as to increase the roster size, adding a further 2 fighters to this version of the game. These additional fighters would include Ayane, who is from the same clan as Kasumi, and there was also Bass Armstrong, an American professional wrestler who happens to be the father of Tina. This new content for the Sony PlayStation version would also later be included in a revised version of the arcade game known as Dead or Alive Plus Plus, which would see release exclusively in Japan. But as for the PlayStation version that the world had at their fingertips, like the Sega Saturn version before it, the gameplay itself would be positively received. IGN went so far as to say that the Model 2 graphics have ported over to the PlayStation better than they've ever been on the Saturn. Dead or Alive is a polished product that pushes Tecmo to the front of a fighting game, hot on the heels of Namco for the title. This is one game you'll definitely have to try and buy. GameSpot was right regarding the PlayStation version that apparently the designers went a little too far when it came to the motion design of the female characters though, because they made it so their breasts bounce while fighting. Honestly, if it weren't for the fact that they keep on bouncing well after they should, it may have been seen as a commendable effort for the designers' keen attention to detail. Overall, Dead or Alive delivers a realistic fighting experience, combining fantastic graphics and above average gameplay. Dead or Alive is a fun and challenging fighting game well worth picking up. Hopefully it won't be overshadowed too much by the US release of Namco's Tekken 3. For all of this, whether it be the arcade version of the game, a conversion for the Sega Saturn or Sony PlayStation, there is no doubt that Dead or Alive left its mark. From the implementation of the game's grab mechanics to its polished graphics and innovative breast physics, Dead or Alive did enough to sell very well, saving Tecmo in the process and thus earning a place in gamers' hearts for years to come. In fact, Dead or Alive proved both successful and marketable enough to end up spawning an entire series of games, all of which we can potentially discuss in the future on here, if you show the appetite for it of course. So if you want a DOA 2 video, be sure to make your voice heard in my comment section down below. Dead or Alive brought to the table exactly what Itagaki intended, a fun game full of sexuality and violence, enough of which to grab consumers' attentions and send gaming journalists into an outraged frenzy. This was enough to make the franchise the stuff of legends that we are still talking about 26 years later. So let's all toast to DOA, let's all toast to jiggle physics. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Dead or Alive. If this is your first time coming here, and you had a jolly good time today, why not check out my recent uploads covering Soul Calibur and Bloody Roar, 2 more polygonal fighting game classics from this unforgettable era. Rather than regularly chasing trends like most YouTubers, I rather create content for you on topics that interest me, and of course you, my audience. So for this reason, having a Patreon is of utmost importance in funding what I do. So if you fancy gaining an end credit on my list of nobility at the end of my videos, and want to see these uploads before everyone else, then please consider backing my work on Patreon. Thank you for helping keep the past alive. Power to the people. Oh, power to the people. Speaking of those who have already did this, special shout outs go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, Hail Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Marcinio, Ryan Ditched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Azaraki, Jotkin Varela, Michael Calix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Chris Ozana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, EC Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Homies Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang-hee, Norma Sticks, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Blaming Renee, Marvin Liga, TOG Driver, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bale, Chris Fisk, Rick67 and Donio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Since Spaces, Punk Toast and everybody else who backs what I do on Patreon. You make Big Daddy Top Hat very proud. Daddy loves you. Yeah. Cheerio.